Very good.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And I'm honoured to be here as the sort of guest of the combined David Hume Institute and the University of Edinburgh. I'm an enormous admirer of the Scottish Enlightenment, which I think was probably the greatest single intellectual flowering in Western Europe since the Renaissance, and David Hume and Adam Smith are two of my great heroes, and indeed I draw on their wisdom in my book, particularly that year which Adam Smith spent down at Balliol, and recognised that university education in England then was so much inferior to university education in Scotland, which led in turn to a whole chapter of The Wealth of Nations reflecting on the lessons from that. So Hume and Adam Smith are great heroes of mine, and this is a fine, beautiful city, and of course a very fine and proud university. So it is great to be here. And what I'm going to do is give you some of the edited highlights from my book, though that doesn't mean that you don't need to buy the book. There's still a lot of gems left over, which may, I hope, sort of tweak your interest. And the book is both an account of some of the history of British universities, some of the current issues, some best speculations about the future. And one of the reasons I wrote it was partly to make sense of my 4 years or so as Minister for Universities and Science, with a peculiar kind of post-devolution breakdown of responsibilities. My responsibilities on science and research were UK-wide. My responsibilities on university teaching and the funding of teaching were England, which might be some relief to people in Scotland. So I'm trying to make sense of that in the book, but it's not really a ministerial memoir. Or if it is a ministerial memoir, it's the first one to have been submitted for academic peer review before it was allowed to be published, which is a discipline they should all have. So here goes. I do begin with the history, because I do think history helps us understand things. And the history is surprisingly important to this day in understanding the shape of the university systems in our country. Yes, goodness. So this chart is probably the most important one. So this tells you that in the early medieval period, before 1300, about a dozen universities were created across Europe. And people will be familiar with Bologna, which probably has a claim to be the first of them. France had 4 or 5. Scotland, sadly, hadn't quite at that point got into the act. And England had Oxford and then Cambridge. Cambridge, a spin-off from Oxford in 1209. So that's the famous historic founding of the first round of universities. And then across the continent, they kept on being created. This is what happened at the time of the Papal Schism. Then you can see by 1500, Italy had got almost 15, France got over 20, Spain 15, and Scotland by this point had got in on the act with several universities. And then by the time of Napoleon, who wrought havoc with the university system, by the time of Napoleon, Italy, France, and Spain had all got 25. Scotland, I think, had got 5 or 6 by then, depending exactly how they define them. But look what happened to England. England had 2 universities by 1309. 600 years later, it still had 2 universities. And this was the result of a deliberate policy of Oxford and Cambridge of suppressing the creation of other universities. The University of Northampton recently celebrated its 10th anniversary as a university and the 750th anniversary of its suppression by Oxford, when it first tried to be a university. And what Oxford and Cambridge did is they put a kind of protectionist restriction on their graduates, unlike what universities in any other part of Europe attempted, which basically said you are only allowed to teach in Oxford and Cambridge. You have to pledge not to teach your jus docendi ubique, actually only, which was supposed to be a right to teach everywhere, actually only allows you to teach in Oxford and Cambridge. And use its closeness, first of all, to the church and then to the British government, to suppress the creation of other universities. Now, this has some implications about how England thinks of its universities to this day. It first of all means you have to go away from home to universities. Because if you think about it, across Europe, that means every major city on the continent had its own university. There were local universities elsewhere. There weren't local universities in England. So you have to go away from home. It also means there's a kind of national system. You think of universities as representing and taking people from across the whole country. So you go away from you go away from home to a university which is an institution which recruits nationwide. That system was developed over 600 years and in many ways is still how we think of the university to this day in England. It also had implications as well for the kind of picture of what a true university was like. Now, this was itself a lively subject of debate. The Inns of Court wanted the status of universities, that was suppressed. This is the Master of Caius College, Cambridge, during the Civil War, asking very sensibly why university and college should only be at Oxford and Cambridge. And he says he looks for, when there was one at least in every great town or city in the nation, as in London, York, Bristol, Exeter, Norwich. It's an early bid for the Russell Group, really. He's speculating why it is that there aren't universities elsewhere in the country. So the dominance of Oxford and Cambridge was only achieved by suppressing alternatives. And Oxford and Cambridge had Oxford and Cambridge had massive producer power, which included that if you wanted to get a post, a well-paid job, notably in the Church of England, you had to go to Oxford and Cambridge. That was the only way to get it. And Adam Smith, in this chapter, reflecting on how you should pay for higher education, makes several observations. I have to say, he attributes one of the reasons he goes out of his way to say Scotland has Europe's best university system, and England does not. He does attribute some of it to the fees that were paid in Scotland, and we may come to that later on. But he also attributed it to the fact that you go to Oxford and Cambridge, not because you want to study, but because it is only by residing in either of those universities that you get access to well-paid jobs. So these privileges, which notably mean being able to secure a certain job, you only acquire them if you go to those universities. So they necessarily force a certain number of students to such universities, independent of the merit or reputation of the teachers. So you're going there in order to get a badge that enables you in turn, a passport that in turn enables you to get a well-paid job afterwards. And I have to say, that observation, that very acute observation, remains relevant to this day in a different form, insofar as McKinsey, or the leading legal practices in Edinburgh and London, or the well-paid, most prosperous banking jobs, are only available to people whose CVs have on them that they've been to a certain subset of universities. So if you need to go to Edinburgh or Oxford or Imperial to get McKinsey to look at your CV, that is actually a modern version of the same phenomenon as Adam Smith was describing. And I think that although there is a real experience of higher education, there is also some signalling, some producer power. And I have sat in the plush offices of senior city law firms down in London who will tell me it's so hard to find really good people nowadays. And I said, well, where do you look? And I said, well, obviously we try Oxford and Cambridge. And you say, have you looked more widely? And they reluctantly say they might consider UCL and Imperial. And that's about it. So and insofar as there are recruiters with those attitudes, that means that you have to go to those universities and you benefit from going there regardless of actually the quality of the teaching that you experience. So it's a very acute and interesting chapter, and it's part of his explanation as to what was wrong with Oxford, drawing on his observations what was wrong with Oxford in the 18th century. Eventually, the government stepped in. There were two changes, actually. The first thing was that eventually in London, UCL was created, and then King's College, in short order, two higher education institutions. I say in the book, it's what every commuter recognises. You wait 600 years for a new higher education institution, and then two come along together. And the University of London was created as a legal framework above both of them with the degree awarding powers. So the monopoly is broken, and Durham created at a similar time, so by the 1830s. And that just throws into relief how appalling the Oxford and Cambridge arrangements are, which included requiring dons dons on the staff of colleges, basically to pledge as part of the condition of getting a tenured post as a don, that you would not support any changes in the Articles of Association of the college. So you entrench these privileges that way. And eventually, it was only government action. It was literally the government, the British government, sending in commissioners to Oxford and Cambridge to open up the processes of the colleges and the university, which led to change. Those historic professorships, the Waynfleet Professor of Metaphysics, the Chichely Professor of History, which have the patina of the Middle Ages to them, those were created by government commissioners in the 1850s by forcibly taking some of the endowments of individual Oxford and Cambridge colleges and reorganizing them to create new professorial posts so as finally to catch up with the new learning that was spreading across Europe from places like Scotland. So although, look, as a minister, I tried to protect the autonomy of universities. When people talked about government intervention as an appalling breach with the ancient hallowed traditions of university autonomy, I do point out here that these are 10 acts of parliament, really, about the major English universities, which took 25 years, really, to sort out. This was a government that opened them up by changing the Test Act so that people who weren't community members of the Church of England had a right to go, and as I said, redesigned and reorganised their endowments. Now, so that's a bit of history. Let me now move to the next stage, and this is in some ways, I think, the most frustrating and for me dispiriting but necessary part of the book. The rise of the edu-skeptics. Now, there always, in a way, have been edu-skeptics. Too many people go to university. Why bother going to university? You don't learn anything, graduates. There's so many graduates going now that there's no graduate premium. All those kind of doubts. When actually, the evidence is very strong that going to university, by and large, changes people and changes them for the better. And in different ways. And you can see, across the top, I'm talking about individual benefits. The bottom is wider benefits. And then the other axis is on the left-hand side, there are non-economic benefits. On the right-hand side, there are economic benefits. And you've got 4 quadrants, therefore, of different types of benefits. And one of the other problems, and one of my frustrations about the sector, much though I love universities, is there's a massive kind of internal argument within universities about which of these are legitimate arguments and observations to draw on. So if you start talking about the individual economic benefits, you're just this is utilitarian appeal to us as if we're just there to train people for the jobs market. You talk about wider economic benefits, that's still utilitarianism. Some people much prefer social benefits of a non-economic sort. And I compare the way we argue about the value of universities with the way we talk about the value of the first 3 years. I personally think the case for the first 3 years, an intervention there is grossly exaggerated. I don't think it has the impact that it's claimed to have. I don't believe that there's some special neuroscientifically significant period in the early years which has to be caught. But the one thing universities can learn from the advocates of the early years is they deploy all these arguments in a kind of melange. And you certainly don't find they waste their time arguing with each other, where some advocates of nurseries think it's illegitimate to argue that people who have early interventions end up earning more in their lives. And other people say, yes, the only virtue for it is it makes people more tolerant. And the people who think it's to boost your earnings are betraying the principles of the nursery system. They don't waste their time arguing with each other about these different types of benefits. They throw them all at you, and they've had fantastic success winning the argument for early years in the past 10 or 20 years. Well, I think these arguments apply to higher education in spades. And every one of these claims, every one of these assertions, by the way, is not a sort of personal expression of opinion. They all are summaries of respectable social science with empirical evidence to back them up. And in most cases, though not every one, proper social science that allows for selection effects. This is where we're trying to disentangle. There is clearly some selection effects. Most of these are attempts at getting effects on top of selection effects. So all the classics, identical twins where one goes to university and then doesn't go to university. There have been some university systems when they're oversubscribed, where they have lotteries to allocate places to some rather than others, using all that type of raw material to identify these effects. Now, I won't go through them now, but perhaps relevant for Edinburgh and elsewhere. There's clearly an effect in the character of a city. And when I look at what is happening to English cities that I'm familiar with, Portsmouth, Worcester, Chester, cities whose investment in, and sometimes even just the creation of universities, is changing the character of those universities. You can see the individual non-economic benefits like longer life expectancy. And we are increasingly getting also some neuroscientific evidence as well about the background for this. But when you are looking for how to finance them, this is obviously a particularly important quadrant. Now, I'm not saying it in moral value, it is the most important quadrant, but when you're looking how to pay for it, the fact that these graduates end up with higher earnings, less likely to be unemployed, increased employability, all that matters. So let me now briefly talk about how to pay for it, which I realise has been much more controversial in England than in Scotland, but I think ultimately we've ended up in England with a better system than there is in Scotland. It starts with this type of evidence, and by the way, this does include selection effects. This is just a simple raw data on how much graduates and non-graduates earn. At the top, it's all adults, 16 to 64. Down here is just people aged 21 to 30. And it's absolutely clear. And oddly enough, despite all the anxieties, the graduate premiums remain fairly robust at all the stages where participation in higher education has grown from the 5% it was in the early 60s to approaching 50%, which we've got now. At every stage, people said the graduate premium is bound to start falling and whatever. It's surprising how robust a phenomenon it is. It could change in the future. None of us can be absolutely confident, but I think there are pretty good reasons why people who've had that extra education tend to be in jobs that pay them more. And when you've got that, it does look reasonable to expect graduates to pay back when they can afford it for the cost of their higher education, rather than expect the generality of taxpayers, many of whom are earning less. Now, I was an English Tory MP for over 20 years, and I don't know which is worse in terms of putting this argument to a Scottish audience. So let's not attribute it to me. Let's attribute it to Karl Marx. And this is Karl Marx's critique of the German Social Democrats' education program, the Goethe program in 1875. And this, of course, is not engraved on a foundation stone outside any Scottish university. But I think Karl Marx had got a point. If they're free, that only means, in fact, defraying the cost of education of the bourgeoisie from the general tax receipts. So that's the progressive argument as to, of course, it's basically saying it's quite a regressive policy if you're using the general taxation to pay for the education of the people who become the bourgeoisie. And it was not some English neoliberal experiment. The debate goes right back to Robbins. This is Robbins, not at the time of his report, though his report has a proper chapter which includes a discussion of whether you should have fees and loans as a means of financing universities, and goes through the pros and the cons, and concludes that the time is not right, but it could be in the future. And the editor is even more explicit about this. The case for equitable arguments for a considerable replacement of grants by loans will become practically relevant. So I think that some model, the one that the Blair government started, and then when I was in the coalition we took forward, of not, of course, expecting students to pay up front, which would be a terrible system, but expecting graduates to pay back if they could afford it through an income contingent loan, so income contingent system, which is related to their earnings. As you know, in England, it's 9% of earnings above 21,000. That will soon go up to 25,000. I think that is that system has many advantages, and here is just a summary of 4 of them. The first of all, it's progressive. That's the point. It means that the more affluent people are paying for higher education. It means that the generality of taxpayers earning less aren't having to, and less affluent graduates don't have to because they don't pay back. It means that you are boosting human capital. Your country is, you don't want that's why you don't want private payment up front. That means there will be some people put off from who would benefit from education and the economy would benefit if they participated. So it's absolutely not a barrier to entry. And some of these continental systems that are praised, if you look at them close up, although the sums are relatively modest, €1,000, €2,000, they often have actual direct cash payment up front. You have to write a check for €1,000 for that term's education. That's what there's some of that in Italy and some of that in France. It solved a problem in the public finances, which I think will become increasingly relevant in Scotland as well, which is when higher education was financed out of public expenditure, it was never a priority claim on public spending. In fact, I would say is an empirical challenge, and you have experience of government under different decades under different governments. I cannot think of a single example of higher education being given priority on public expenditure alongside other stages of education, let alone other programs altogether. So I would postulate the empirical proposition when faced between spending more on primary education or secondary education or higher education never wins. And when education is alongside the NHS or pensions or whatever, it's quite hard for education to win. So higher education being dependent on the public purse was bad for higher education. The unit of resource was falling. And then finally, the opportunity, which is when it is public spending, the way that governments control public spending is by controlling the numbers of people going to university. So what we were able to do when we shifted to this system, when finally higher education essentially exited from being dependent on public expenditure, was at the same time we were able to get rid of number controls. Whereas in Scotland, where higher education is still a claim on public spending, there still are number controls, which means that I have sat at UCAS in August when they're doing the annual process of people being allocated places, and have seen and observed Scottish universities still recruiting people from England because they're all bringing the resource with them to pay for their education, when those universities are already full for Scottish students. There are no more places if you're a Scottish student financed out of public expenditure, because for them the number controls apply. And indeed, because that means that participation in higher education in Scotland is controlled in a way it's not in England, I always say the students who don't get a place are often the marginal students from the less affluent backgrounds, which is why we've done better in England at getting more students from low-income backgrounds into university than in Scotland. So these are legitimate areas of public policy difference. The devolution settlement allows Scotland to have a different model. I have to say, sometimes the assumption in Scotland that the Scottish model is manifestly morally superior to the English one does rather rankle, because I think we've actually delivered more social mobility with more access for low-income students than Scotland has. So that is the system. Some people say about England, I won't go into this in much detail because this is very much an English debate. I did say there would be price competition. There hasn't been price competition. I think in many ways it's a good thing that there isn't price competition. And one of the reasons is that this is a very interesting list. I would claim that this list kind of roughly reflects what the average middle-class parent thinks is the standard of the university, the implicit ranking that people have in the back of their minds as to the most prestigious universities. Edinburgh, you'll please see, pretty high up, and it carries on. That is I would say, is the ranking of universities that most people have in their heads. And I'm frustrated arguing with Andrew Adonis or others. I get endlessly told with great confidence, so-and-so is a good university and others are a less good university. And that ranking is actually an empirical, objective ranking. And guess what it is? Here is a clue. That is a picture of a Brideshead revisited picture of Oxford. It is actually ordering universities by the percentage of their students that come from the less affluent social classes. So it starts with only 10% participation in Oxford and Cambridge, and gradually you move up until Bradford has got over 50% of people from less affluent. So my view is the ranking is based, if I was trying to find a single metric that captured these valuations, it's basically social composition of the student body. Which is why, incidentally, when we're told, well, we should give more money to the good universities, because they're the ones that we know are, quotes, good, you're actually advocating a kind of reverse pupil premium. Whereas in primary and secondary education, we say if you're taking more students from disadvantaged backgrounds, you should have more money. We'd be saying, it's shocking, these places like London Met, East London, full of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and full of kids from black and minority ethnic groups. We must certainly cut their funding. Relative to these universities over here, full of white kids from the middle classes, they're excellent, let's give them more money. So I find it a difficult argument to defend in principle, the argument that you should have price allocate prices by some concept of what's good or not. And that's when they, and that I would argue is one of the reasons why there are higher earnings. I commissioned empirical research about all this to try to understand the higher earnings of students in these backgrounds at these universities, and it did appear to be explained by those main factors. So, in England, there's a debate about how we should change the system, and again, this is not something that needs trouble you so much in Scotland, so I won't give it in great detail. Differential fees, I've said I'm not confident we've actually got a good basis for differential fees. Some people just say the fees should be lower, but my fear is that that means cutting the resource. And just in England, if you were to cut fees and so were to reduce the amount of money behind the education of 1.2 million first-time voters, I think that would not be a smart political move, is my astute judgment after more than 20 years as an MP. I can think of better ways of winning votes. And indeed, one of the issues in Scotland is the unit of resource per Scottish student is already lower than the unit of resource behind an English student and is falling behind. So that's a pressure point here that we have escaped with our model. A graduate tax, well, it does mean it's once more a claim on public spending. And of course, a graduate tax could have very odd distribution effects. In a way, we've got a graduate tax in England, starting in a 9% rate of graduate tax on earnings above £21,000. If you want to start at a lower level than that, then you're bringing lower income graduates into your graduate tax the first time. Why would you want to bring it down? And at the top end, if you want to collect a lot more from well-paid graduates, there comes a point, and this was the Gordon Brown, Tony Blair argument. Gordon Brown was an advocate of a graduate tax in the Labour government. There comes a point when studying law or economics at a university like Edinburgh or Oxford or Imperial is manifestly a lifetime decision to be paying a higher rate of income tax. A higher rate of income tax costing far more than the actual cost of your higher education. So for the first time, you do create a real incentive to exit the higher education system and study abroad and then come back. Why face a 5% higher income tax through your working life by virtue of doing law in Oxford, not at Harvard? So it creates, I think, quite a significant competitive challenge for universities. We've raised the repayment threshold, I personally think, unnecessarily. And there are some ideas around you could devote the money to some other purpose, but as it's not public spending, it's hard really to shift it to another purpose. I think there are some things we could do to improve our system, and here are some of them, but this is an English debate and doesn't need to detain us. I'd like briefly now to talk about another set of issues. I want to talk about the universities and the environment for science and innovation, and then some issues for the future. And let me go back to the history, because there's another strand of history that's really important. It was Humboldt who wrote what has been described as the greatest white paper in the history of Western higher education, which is not an account that's ever been, a claim that's ever been made about a white paper I was responsible for in 2011. What Humboldt did is, after Prussia had been defeated by Napoleon, he wrote a document advocating essentially that Prussia rebuilds itself by rebuilding its universities and giving them a research role. And this is seen classically as the origin of the research university, which in the 19th century was based in Germany. England, after all those painful reforms I described earlier, had universities that were doing a bit better on teaching, but weren't really anything for the Germans. They described Oxford by the end of the 19th century as a great gymnasium, by which they meant it's quite good at teaching, but it doesn't, of course, do any serious research. It was the First World War that brought home to us that although we'd been the home of the First Industrial Revolution, we really were not keeping up to speed with the Second Industrial Revolution, because in Germany, science there has been more thoroughly and effectively applied to the solution of scientific problems bearing on trade and industry. And this is an English problem in particular, less acute in Scotland. And so this white paper in 1915, therefore, proposes the government having a much more significant role in promoting research, and a great part of all research will necessarily be done in universities and colleges, which are already aided by the state. So 100 years after Germany, we finally embrace a role for the university as the home of research. And another interesting historical curiosity. So there was a recognition of a problem as soon as we went into the blockades of the First World War, we suddenly discovered there were lots of things we could only get by buying them from Germany, and that was the background there. There was something else as well, which was we hoped that America would join the war, and America was very slow and reluctant to join the war. And in 1916, a British journalist went out to find why America was still neutral and wrote an article which had a big impact on the public debate, because he came back with the observation there was one German influence on America which we have not comprehended, which is that if you wish to move on and up in American universities, for which you need a postgraduate qualification, you have to go to Germany to study for your postgraduate qualification, because there are no postgraduate qualifications in English universities. And come back and observe that, a third of the professors at Harvard had studied in Germany. There was a massive German influence on America via its education system. So the Foreign Office, not any Home Department, the Foreign Office summoned British vice-chancellors to a meeting asking them to create doctoral programs to offer an alternative attraction for American students so they don't all go to Germany. Hence the first DPhil in Oxford in 1917 and subsequent doctorates. The doctorates were created in response to competition with Germany for American students. One English vice-chancellor, the vice-chancellor of Birmingham, very astutely said at the meeting, the crucial meeting, it's great you want us to advance and go out and recruit postgraduate students from America, but when they come to English universities in particular, they'll be shocked by the poor quality of the facilities. So it'd be great if there was a little exchequer budget that enabled us to invest in improving them. Smart move, smart move. And that's why for the first time you really start getting significant public expenditure through HEFGE, the University Grants Committee, created in 1919 eventually legally and disappearing legally next week. So a kind of end of a 99-year history of funding universities that way, and also led to the creation of what was the Committee of Vice-Chancellors and Principals, now Universities UK. So we finally did it. I don't think there's time for me to get into detail, but I argue that we have ended up, after that peculiar start with not really doing much research and not in universities, we've ended up with an unusually high proportion of our research now happening in universities. And here are the figures in the book. So England has got about 26% of its total R&D budget. This is both public and private spend happening in universities. Germany, it's 17%. US, it's 14%. This is because we haven't got networks of research institutes outside universities now. And I think it's a big defect in our system that we haven't got, ended up with a system that is very highly university-oriented. Now, finally, the three issues of the future. Two of which are challenges facing universities across the UK. The final one is an area where, and it's a great note on which to end, England can certainly learn from Scotland. So first of all, international, and Brexit is, let's face it, a massive challenge for our universities, and it could have an impact in a range of different ways. We have had an increasingly restrictive visa regime. I used to have terrible arguments with the then Home Secretary. I can't think what's happened to her since. With the then Home Secretary about all this, and things like post-study work, which really was an attraction for one of the things you could come and study afterwards, now restricted. It still exists in a form, but now restricted. And I do urge people, and universities, including this university, one of my arguments with Theresa, I used to say, we're disagreeing on whether or not overseas students are a burden or an asset, and why don't we have a proper migration advisory committee investigation to try to at least establish the facts, which she opposed. And I think it's fantastic. We have now got a MAC investigation, and universities should not see this as just a defensive operation to protect themselves from further Home Office attack. Universities themselves should go on the attack with evidence to the MAC asking for a more liberal regime so that more overseas students can be attracted with fewer restrictions. So we certainly need to attract more students from overseas. We're attracting about 500,000 a year to the UK. By contrast, about 30,000 British students go and study abroad. And this is too low. Many more British students would benefit from going abroad. And if you look at it from the perspective of a sort of free trade economist, you could argue that our system, where you can only spend your student loan within the UK, is a classic non-tariff barrier to trade. And I think when Liam Fox goes around the world and starts negotiating these trade agreements, he will find in places like India and Australia and the US, they will say, we actually put some public funding, scholarships and other arrangements to finance our students to come and study in the UK. But why don't you do anything reciprocally? That's one of the reasons why so few of your students come abroad. So part of the trade agreement, can we agree that your student loans will be legitimate, can be spent on higher education in country X? And I think there will be that argument, and a good thing too. And already there have been practical constraints as universities come together in airline-type alliances. So Warwick, for example, is linked to Monash in Australia. They worked together to create courses that were aligned so that you could do a year in Warwick and a second year in Monash and a third year in Warwick, and they would all be integrated courses. But what was the obstacle? They found that a student from Warwick doing that second year at Monash, they were not entitled to take any fee loan with them in order to fund that second year at Monash. So it has been a barrier, and that barrier should go. Clearly, it's important that we continue and enhance, if anything, the mobility of staff. It's important that we participate in Framework Programme 9, which will replace Horizon 2020. And I know from talking to my excellent successors, and Sam Giemer is very focused on signalling as clearly as he can that Britain wants to participate in FP9 and would therefore like to role in helping even to shape FP9. It's tough, but I hope we can get it as a constructive role, a constructive outcome from the Brexit negotiations. And finally, one of the paradoxical effects of Brexit is a lot of universities that had put all their effort into trying to get a campus in China or wherever, now suddenly, having taken for granted connections with the continent, now they're going to have to work very hard to maintain them. And the trend, and I don't know where Edinburgh is, and it might come up in discussion, there are quite a few leading British universities are now for the first time looking at campuses on the continent of Europe, to be active on the continent, to increase their chances of being eligible for research funding on the continent. Oxford has signed an agreement with the leading universities in Berlin for Oxford to start with a research centre in Berlin. So that one of the paradoxical effects of Brexit is going to be shifting UK university activity to the continent on a scale which has not happened before. So Brexit is a disaster. But there we are. Just two other quick items. This is a picture of a lecture at the University of Bologna. And it has some similarities to what 750 years later is happening here at Edinburgh. There are people in the back row who appear to be more interested in having a conversation between each other. Someone who's fallen asleep there. There's always the keen people in the front row with the books out, looking very attentive. They even seem, and I apologise for the stereotypes, to have smuggled some women in to be keen in the front row. And it's contemporary in other ways as well. We know from the records that this is actually Henry of Germany lecturing in Bologna. We know this is international education. This is a lecturer who travelled from Germany. Indeed, the historians tell us that one of the first, if not the first, use of the concept of the nation was in the medieval university, where students were organised around the part of Europe that they came from, the nationes, and so they were structured in terms of Angles and Picardians and Germans. So there was one of the origins of a sense of national identity in these different groups of students organised by nationality. I think this is finally going to, I think this kind of exchange will still carry on, but there will be many other forms in which university education changes. I think there's one of the most important challenges to universities is if they get disintermediated. If you can do an online course, at the end of it have some kind of reliable summation that you have completed the course, and you then, which can be done itself online, and you then put onto your LinkedIn profile that you've completed this course, and the employer uses that as a legitimate means of recruiting you, then there's a real challenge to the status and significance of the university degree. So I think that's something to look out for. I think there is an increasing growth of small private online courses, and I should declare an interest. I advise one of the leading American providers of those to you. The bit most exciting upside is the data analytics, of understanding how every individual is learning, the data. And one of the frustrations about pedagogy, one of the frustrations about trying to understand what learning gain is at university, is how little data there is about exactly what is happening to people, the education experience. I have the privilege of being on the board of the Crick Institute in London. We had one graph, one chart we showed in our sort of public gallery space of our scientific data, which if you looked at the footnote, said this draws on 230 million data points. There aren't currently 230 million data points for education across the whole of Scotland. But as soon as there are proper online textbooks and every interaction, every keystroke can be analysed, and we can understand where people slow up, what they find difficult, where the patterns of the mistakes they make, at that point, the challenge of being able to redesign educational materials continuously in the light of evidence about exactly how people are learning will be transformative and will strengthen education. So education technology, I'm an optimist about. Let me end with this other challenge, which is an English challenge where things are unambiguously better in Scotland, which is the biggest single drawback in English education is early specialisation. And this is one of the examples. And it is what this tells you is that only 25% of girls who get an A star in GCSE physics stay on to do A-level physics in England. These are the type of effects. I see Dame Jocelyn in the audience, which is a privilege that she's here, but let's face it, we do have a problem in England in particular of girls doing STEM subjects. And part of the solution is to try to win the battle with the hearts and minds of 16-year-old girls, but to be absolutely honest, we shouldn't be expecting 16-year-olds, boys or girls, to be taking that kind of decision. They should be staying with a wider range of subjects for longer. I don't want us to have scientists who haven't studied any literature or history since the age of 16, nor do I want to have people going out into the wider world having studied history or PPE, as I did, who haven't studied any science since the age of 16. The two cultures, C.P. Snow's two cultures, was not a fundamental divide between different intellectual disciplines. It was an accurate account of the perverse effects of a particular structure of education which we suffer from in England. I think the Scottish model of a broader range of subjects for longer is a much better way of doing it. Of course, it means you are very likely to do 4 years at university rather than 3. So be it. That's fine. And one of the interesting challenges is, I would conclude, is that I do think Scotland, however difficult it may appear, has got something to learn from England about how higher education is financed. England certainly has a lot to learn from Scotland about how it is structured. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I suppose I'm the third David now in the programme, and I suppose it's a Thursday night and it's a question time. We need to have someone called David. What are they? Something. Wow. Anyway, enough of that. We've got about just under 25 minutes. I think in good traditional style we have some roving microphones, and I think it would be useful to Lord Willetts if you were just to say briefly who you are when you ask a question. And I think what I'll try and do, at least see if it works at the beginning, is I'll maybe take a couple of questions to start with and see how that works. We might break into one-on-one. Anyway, does someone want to volunteer to do that dreadful bit in Scotland? Question. There we go.
Much. My claim to fame is that I already own a copy of your book and would be delighted if you would sign it for me. I was very taken by your graph about the essentially social stratification of universities. And equivalent information in Scotland says that if you take the most disadvantaged quintile, then 23% of students in colleges doing higher education programmes, typically HND, come from that quintile. So colleges are doing well to redress the balance. If you go up to the other end and look at St Andrews, you're at about 8%. There's huge pressure on universities to try to redress that balance and take more students from the most disadvantaged quintile. And there are equivalent pressures in England. But in terms of actually making that change, do you have any comment on whether we should be trying to do that or just accept that higher education is available? And if we are to try to do it, how would we achieve it?
You think one more? Bob. Microphone.
Thank you. Bob Cormack. I was the principal of the University of the Highlands and Islands. I wonder what you think about the decision that was made in John Major's government to convert the polytechnics into universities. You didn't make any mention of that. And perhaps in answer to that, think about the Technische Hochschulen in Germany and how successful they've been alongside some of the German universities. Thank you.
Yep. Right, well, two very, very important questions, or well, three questions. So the answer to the first one is yes, I'll certainly sign it, and look forward to that afterwards. On your other question about access, I do think there is more that universities can do, and I fully understand that the Scottish debate, although I gave the very sort of simplified results, the Scottish debate ties into your 2+2 question. It's true you do better at getting people into the first 2 years. In terms of getting to university, and the second 2 years, which I would argue is really crucial for the onward march of social mobility and getting on into well-paid jobs. That's where the constraints really come down in Scotland. A lot of universities in England and I have to say some in Scotland say kind of it's the problem is the earlier stages. If only the schools had done better, then we would be able to recruit the students and it would all be fine. But the schools are the problem. And one of them, and I don't agree with that approach. I think one of the problems in the education debate across the UK is the tendency of every stage to blame the previous stage for their problems. And everyone said, if only that had been sorted out earlier, it would have been fine. But, you know, what am I supposed to do there? And that goes right back down to the early years preoccupation. My view is that universities are not simply, and should not simply recruit people by the quality of their exam results at the previous stage. And in America, the approach is different, including in the Ivy League. I think I report in the book a conversation with the person in charge of admissions at Harvard who said if we just took the people who got the highest SAT scores in the US, we'd end up just producing a large number of middle-ranking programmers for IBM. And she was absolutely explicit that they had a completely different approach to recruitment. They mould the class, and it's partly ethnic mix, but it's they absolutely are clear there are other criteria as well. They're looking for future leaders. And my view is that universities can legitimately look beyond prior academic attainment. You may have to make some effort, and again, these programs exist, I know, to help make those kids ready. But in King's College London, where I'm a visiting professor, we've got an example of what can be done, which is that we've got a medical school that was taking a highly socially selective group, and Cyril Chandler, one of our leading medics, was going around a comprehensive in a less affluent part of South London and says at the end of his talking to the class, well, perhaps one of these days one of you will be a doctor at King's. To which the head teacher said afterwards, nobody here gets 3 A's at A level, and you have to have 3 A's at A level to do medicine at King's, and no person here is ever going to be able to have a job like that. And King's went back and created an extra strand, so it was an extra recruitment, where they took kids from disadvantaged backgrounds with significantly lower A-level grades, B's and C's, and invested in an extra year of higher education. And eventually they are passing out of King's, not quite at the same rate as the rest, but pretty good. They are, you're talking about 86% graduation as against 96% graduation rate percentages, so not bad. And they are then perfectly capable of being consultants and doctors across London, just like the other King's recruits. So it can be done. And then finally on polytechnics, I argue in the book actually for a broad conception of the university that includes the vocational model and indeed argues that part of the effect of the Oxbridge domination has been for us to value that mission and to think other missions need different names. So I don't mind the fact that the universities focused on vocational roles and vocational training that have provided their higher education institutions. I don't begrudge them the name university. And it's fascinating, even in Germany, many of the Technische Hochschulen are now taking the name university. They themselves want university title. They tend to call themselves technological universities now, but they're going for the university name. And so I argue for a broad conception of university that embraces several distinct missions.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm Thomas Ward. It's hard to fault your arguments about the university sector, which is now really quite well funded across the whole of the UK, and it probably accommodates about 45% of young people of that age group. I'd be interested to hear your comments, though, about the 55% of young people who did not go to university and do not enjoy anything like the same level of funding or attention.
We'll just take Peter's question here.
Thank you. Peter Matheson, I'm in my 7th week as the principal of the University of Edinburgh. I had 2 questions, actually, if I might be allowed. One is about the value for money argument. So the Office for Students, which is about to take over from HEFCE, is talking about its role in defending value for money. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how much universities should be driven by value for money. It doesn't matter where that money's come from. Is it coming from tuition fees or government or whatever? And the second question, I just wanted to pick up on something that you said about the 4-year degree. So as you and I think discussed when we met in Hong Kong moved from a 3-year undergraduate degree to a 4-year undergraduate degree and did it brilliantly, in my view, and used the 4th year to promote general education in the way that you support. There is pressure for 2-year degrees, and there are people arguing, why do we need 3 years in England? Is that pressure going to come in Scotland as well, and how strongly should we try and resist it?
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's some very interesting questions. I agree that the real agenda now is the other 55%. There is a dangerous mistake around, I have to say, in the British debate, which some people are saying that the money that goes into HE is available to be reallocated in England for other purposes, when higher education in England is not really public expenditure at all. So it's not public expenditure you can somehow take and put into other categories. I think the case is for public spending is what's needed for those other people. We've, I think, had in England an excessive focus on apprenticeships, which are desirable, but they only really work for a subset of people because you need to have a job beforehand, and I think there are only certain types of jobs where there's apprenticeships in the classic sense. So it's really a matter of non-HE, non-apprenticeship vocational training, and that probably requires public expenditure to support it to provide better programs. But I would stick with, and I rather like the traditional names, you know, the BTECs, the City Guilds, the HNCs, the HNDs. They're recognised by employers. And they are not as well funded as, they don't have the same amount of total resource behind them as HE does, and they should have more resource, but it probably has to be public expenditure. On Peter's questions, on value for money and the role of OFS, I understood, and indeed I set out in my book, the need for a regulator, which is not quite the same as the old grant giver. I mean, HEFCE was in reality the regulator, and your equivalent in Scotland, but the regulation came via the kind of power of the purse and was a sort of informal power that came from its being a major source of revenues for universities. I think so. I do understand we need a regulator that does not depend on the power of the purse in the same way. But I personally would have gone for a kind of son of HEFCE model, trying to keep some of the historical patina, some of the status, some of the authority that the Higher Education Funding Council commands. And the danger is if the OFS becomes much more an instrument for the transmission of whatever the ministerial preoccupations are at the moment. And one of the reasons why we have a strong university system is precisely that universities are autonomous, and it's worth fighting for that, and that's a crucial value. It's worth fighting for in Scotland, and it's worth fighting for in England. And then finally on the four-year course, it's interesting, this contrast, which you rightly draw attention to, Peter, between 2 years or 4 years. And I think this reveals a deep-seated sort of failure in England to understand the value of education. Because if you look at our education system, my view is that the basic problem with English education is it's too early, too quick, too narrow. And England has some of the Western world's youngest graduates. And we've schoolified the early years, shockingly, with no real educational value whatsoever. We rush people into an early decision on which subjects they should do far earlier than other countries. And we then that enables us to get them through university quickly, because they've started specialising. So an 18-year-old going to do physics at an English university will know more physics than an 18-year-old from almost any other country in Europe. So we get them all through quickly, and they turn out as 21-year-olds or 22-year-olds. And I don't think it's a very good system. And even our master's courses, 1 year rather than when in most countries they're 2 years. It's all done quickly. And I think it should be longer and slower. Ultimately, this is an area where I'm up for student power. I think it's what young people choose that will really matter. And my argument and my observation is, first of all, the shocking one that I think a lot of students actually like being at university. They quite enjoy it. And indeed, there was a fascinating essay composition by UCAS where it was asking people in their first year at university to describe the experience. And the most overwhelming message, and I don't know to what extent this applies in Scotland as well as in, was quite simply, at last I can enjoy myself without all these exams all the time and everything being completely driven by exam requirements and the gamification of education. So you no longer focus on things you're actually studying, but everything is done in terms of, if you use these 3 words, you'll get an extra couple of marks in the GCSEs or the A-levels or whatever. So I think they like being at university, and I think if it's a matter of responding to pressure from students, it's the 4-year course that will win out, way above the 2-year course. England is already at the limits of acceptability because the number of hours you do in terms of compliance with Bologna, we're quite lucky that our relatively limited undergraduate courses pass muster as suitable for an honours degree within the Bologna system. We can't cut the hours and the length much more. And I think in Scotland you should fight vigorously for keeping the 4-year model. I think it's fantastic. You're absolutely right. I remember that conversation. I think Hong Kong is an interesting example. No, I think 4 years is a civilised course, a civilised time, and it's one of the things that Scotland can be proud of, as something differentiated from the English model.
Thank you very much. Now, I know there's one from the last round at the front here, if you get the microphone. And then I'm going to go for the gentleman there, and then I'll take that one. My left eye is my blind eye, by the way. But there's one gentleman up there, and then I think we'll... Do you want to take 4 and then that might be it?
Yes, let's
take 4 and that might be it.
Yep. I might need to note down if it's 4. Yep.
Hello, Sam Sarnes from KPMG. You spoke a lot about the personal and broader economic advantages of higher education. Within that context, do you think the preoccupation with student satisfaction, especially for vast bulk of students who don't have anything to compare it to, has gone a little bit too far?
Yeah.
Okay, the gentleman up there.
Hello, I'm Andrew Miller on the General Council of Edinburgh University. There's not been much discussion of the effect of Brexit on Erasmus scheme.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment on that, please?
And then the gentleman in the pullover there, thank you.
Simon Clark from the School of Economics here. I think one of the advantages of the English system is it provides an amount of insurance if your earnings don't actually take off as you might have hoped for. And I think that's a great advantage, that in some sense you're insured against taking on a huge amount of debt after a certain period of time. It's written off. And that, of course, has added to public expenditure, perhaps more than the Treasury had anticipated. I would like to say something a bit about the Scottish system, because I think if we're charging overseas students here £20,000 a year, and we're providing that free to citizens of Scotland, that's a massive subsidy to the Scottish middle classes. And I think that's something that you've touched on, but needs much more emphasis. That compared to other systems and compared to what we could have, I think that and it's something that was picked up, I think, in the 45% discussion. The current funding system is a massive subsidy to people who are going to go to university anyway.
Okay. That's maybe a bit more of a statement than a question, but we'll come over to the last one here, the woman at the end of this row, and I know there must be many more, but we'll maybe just close it at that.
I'm Amrita. I represent the University of Edinburgh's interests in Mumbai for the South Asia region, and I'm interested in your views on global access and what role do you think that British universities have to play going forward, in contrast with the approach that American universities have taken to welcoming students regardless of financial ability.
Right, on student satisfaction, yeah, I mean, I think it is useful. And it does, we need to dig into it in a more granular way, just in a kind of how was it for you question. But when you got into, it's very interesting when you got into the specifics. I think it's much more illuminating when you find, for example, that although general levels of satisfaction are quite high, you then ask about specific aspects of the academic experience, and not getting work back promptly is quite a significant. Academic feedback on work shows up in most of these satisfaction surveys as a significant source of dissatisfaction. And it's actually when you dig into the detail, you find what I think are useful messages. On Erasmus, I am a little bit of a heretic on Erasmus, because Erasmus was designed as an exchange program. The model of Erasmus is that the host country funds the visiting Erasmus students, and as the flows are all thought to be exchange flows, that all nets out. Actually, the UK is a massive net receiver of Erasmus students, contrary to the model, and has no means of funding them, because you can't charge them fees, so they are actually a claim on university resources. So I personally I know the secretary holder is very keen on it. I personally found this quite a significant problem because it was a source of financial pressures. We're in such a weak position post-Brexit, we'll probably be begging to stay in Erasmus, but as I say, it has that unusual phenomenon. It's because Britain has historically been a very popular place for students from the rest of Europe to come to. If they can get here under Erasmus and avoid any fees and loans, they do so. I agree. I mean, thinking of our system as one with an insurance element, because you don't pay, if you're not in a well-paid job, you don't pay back, is a key feature of the system. And similarly, I have to agree that in Scotland, using limited public money to pay for the education of people who would have gone anyway and end up in well-paid middle-class jobs, I mean, that's why Marx was right. And what I find surprising is that the Scottish system is so my reading of the Scottish debate, people just pat themselves on the back. We've got a so much more progressive system than the horrible English one, when actually I do think the English one is more progressive than the Scottish one. Then there's Mumbai and the Indian issue. Yeah, and I think there is indeed a tension in the British rhetoric, where although we talk about brightest and best, in reality, as public support for students from abroad is quite limited, we are really recruiting the more affluent students from sending countries such as India. And I think you're right to raise that. I think it is a big challenge. We do have some schemes, some scholarship schemes, but they are tiny compared with the flow of students. It's fascinating if you compare our use of public funding for education in developing countries with, say, Germany's. Germany, in England, because of, I have to say, sorry, in the UK, especially because of the Gordon Brown preoccupation with everybody going to school, and girls in particular going to school, and I have to make it absolutely clear, I get into terrible trouble. I'm in favour of girls going to school, I'm in favour of more primary education, just to make that clear. But the balance of the funding in the UK aid budget is something like 6% of it helps to fund overseas students coming to the UK. If you look at German overseas aid for expenditure, I think the figure is 66% of their aid budget going on students from less affluent backgrounds abroad, funding them to come and study in Germany. And I remember the anger and the frustration with talking to some education ministers in developing countries who were incredibly unhappy that we weren't doing anything to help fund training geologists and accountants and people they needed. Naledi Pandor, the South African minister, felt incredibly strongly about this. And I remember one minister, I think it was the Afghan minister, saying, are you doing this deliberately so that we are actually dependent on big American multinationals if we want a geological survey of where the precious materials are in Afghanistan? And of course, although it's marvellous to help send kids to school, I do say, what would the history of Scotland and England been like if there hadn't been publicly funded universities until our countries had achieved 100% literacy and numeracy? The fact is that although 100% literacy and numeracy is a fantastic objective to have, if we had said we've got to sort out the schools first, I don't think we wouldn't have had the Scottish Enlightenment, and we'd have had a very different history. And indeed, I think it's marvellous that the new revised Millennium Development Goals, which initially had fallen a prey for this kind of early years agenda, the later version, for the first time, thank heavens, has goals for tertiary education as well. And the World Bank, having previously only funded primary education, are now realising this was enfeebling and I think India has had a better history than, say, Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, when we decolonised, we left behind some quite strong universities, which we completely failed then to fund or support, and massively weakened the performance of Africa. So I think my view is there is a bit of, just as the agenda is rebalancing through better understandings of neuroscience, so I think there's a better approach to economic development in developing countries, which realises that in the West we can support higher education both in country and here in the West, as well as other stages of education.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your questions, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to Lord Willetts for handling such a range of questions. I'll now hand over to Peter Matheson for a more formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't have a microphone, so I'll just shout, but I just really want to say thank you very much to David personally for spending time and coming here, for preparing and for writing the book, and for everything that he's done to support education. When you were in government, and everything you've done since, I think, demonstrated that you actually care about universities, and actually you do appreciate the value of universities to the nation. And I just hope that the current government contains enough people that also understand that, because in the context of Brexit and everything else, I'm not sure, and I just hope that people can align with that belief in the value of universities and their value to society and their value to the nation, not just economic, but general and social and societal. So thank you very much for demonstrating that. Thank you for continuing to demonstrate that, and please don't stop arguing for the importance of universities, because I know that people do listen to you. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks very much to KPMG for their support of the occasion. I'm supposed to thank the University of Edinburgh as well, so I'll thank myself for providing the venue, but I need to thank university staff that are involved in providing the venue and maintaining the security on the door and keeping the lights on. And finally, I gather there's a glass of wine for everybody outside if you'd like to join us outside, and I hope we'll be able to continue the discussion and maybe continue questioning Lord Willetts. But just please join me in thanking Lord Willetts for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.